It's always awful when a great player fouls out. It's especially bad when he fouls out after picking up a triple-double. And it's even worse when the game goes into overtime without him. Now in this case, the Bulls lost largely because Michael Jordan picked up 6 fouls, all 6 in the fourth quarter. And that was mostly because of Dennis Rodman. Well, so why do we have these rules anyway? I mean, why do we have rules that allow guys to foul out, or even worse, that allow players who are notorious to sort of goad another player into committing a foul and get him to foul out? I mean, why not just let the players stay on? After all, fouls are an integral part of the game of basketball, and they're already punished by free throws, right? Well, as you know, fouls are a pretty common sight in basketball. Sometimes they're called, but often they're not. As you probably already know, there are times where you want to foul for strategic purposes. And of course, there are times where you absolutely don't want to foul, but a foul is called anyway. Now, have you ever wondered about the history of fouling? You know, have you ever wondered who decided how many fouls you get when you foul out? Well, I've done some research on the subject, and I've actually been kind of surprised by the contradictory information that I found, so let's jump in. Now, the first basketball rules were published in a magazine called The Triangle way back in January 1892. Though it was primitive, it was still pretty close to the game that we know and love today, as you can see in the illustration. Now, fouls were a part of the game right from the beginning, but the rules were different. Players would be disqualified until the next basket was made if they made a second foul. And if the official determined that they tried to hurt the other person, then they'd be kicked out immediately with no substitution allowed. Now, interestingly, running with the ball, traveling as we think of it today, would also count as a foul. And 3 consecutive fouls committed by one team would count as a basket for the other team. Of course, you know, the game was completely different back then. Dribbling wasn't even a thing. In fact, when dribbling was first allowed in 1901, you could only bounce the ball one time. But even though things were completely different, the sport was really popular, especially at the college level. If you look, you can find tons of articles about games like this one from early 1908. Descriptions of rough games with lots of fouling were pretty common in those days. In part because of the rough play, the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States put together a basketball rules committee in late 1907. In June 1908, the committee made its first revision to the rules, and they dictated that a player would be disqualified from the game entirely if he committed 5 fouls. Now, most of the websites you'll find will tell you that the disqualification limit for fouls went from 2 to 4 in 1911. However, it is clear from the newspaper archives that the 5-foul rule actually started in 1908, in college at least. Now, the 5-foul rule didn't really have the desired effect. In other words, players continued to foul each other just like they always had. Sending players off for committing too many fouls was really upsetting to fans, and there were always claims that the refs were not calling the game correctly. Although the disqualification rule was intended to make the game less rough, the truth is that it really didn't prevent teams from fouling, just like how it doesn't today. And so it's easy to find articles like this from February 1909 about slow games that were hampered by tons and tons of fouls. Of course, it's impossible to say today whether all the foul calling was justified or not. It's only clear that there was a lot of fouls. In June 1910, the rule changed. Now you'd be sent off for picking up 4 fouls, not 5. This strict rule was described as a success, of course, but as usual, it's not clear that it wound up actually having any effect. Now, the problem that goes unsaid here is a strategic problem, and you know this if you've played basketball really at any competitive level. There are times where you want to foul. In fact, there are situations where you might be willing to sacrifice a player who's about to foul out in order to prevent the other team from doing something or in order to stop their momentum. So instead of thinking about fouls like mistakes, we should think of them as a kind of basketball currency. That rule stayed in place until 1944 when the Minnesota State High School League decided to experiment with increasing the limit to 5 fouls. Now, the explanation behind this change was that the 4-foul limit had originally been put in place to fight against an extremely violent form of basketball, and that the game had changed enough by 1944 that there was no longer worry about that kind of violence. The thinking was that the game in the 1940s was a lot faster and more athletic, and that it was natural that players would bump into each other and foul each other. And so the 5-foul rule came into effect in most of the United States in summer 1944. Of course, if you watch, say, this Utah-Dartmouth NCAA championship game from March 1944, you will wonder what in the world they meant by a fast and athletic sport. From today's perspective, this game looks really slow and the players seem to be really unathletic. Seriously, you have no idea how much the sport has changed until you spend time watching something like this. And so I guess we can only imagine what the sport was like in 1908 and 1909. Anyway, the change to 5 fouls at the college level was seen as a wartime measure in the 1940s when it came. But just like the relaxed substitution rules in college football around the same time, this rule wound up sticking on. Nobody wanted to go back to the days of 4 fouls for a disqualification. But, of course, the NBA's rule is 6 fouls, so where does that come from? Well, that rule originally came from the old Basketball Association of America, which was formed in 1946. So in October 1947, the BAA announced that it was increasing the foul limit from 5 to 6. The BAA did this because their games lasted 48 minutes instead of the 40 minutes that college teams played. Of course, the game still wasn't all that well developed in those days. Defenses still had a long way to go. But it's really interesting to see how quickly things changed from 5 fouls in 1945 to 6 in 1947. And that's where it stood ever since. Now, the rule for disqualification for fouls has always been controversial. It was designed to prevent a particularly aggressive kind of basketball, sure. However, there is a lot of evidence that the threat of disqualification has done nothing to prevent fouling. One obvious problem is that there's not much you can do to overcome a height advantage in the post other than foul. Some of these fouls, of course, are clearly flagrant. Now, one idea that comes up from time to time is to completely get rid of fouling out. Well-known analyst Dave Heron advocated for this back in the late 1980s. The argument was that removing the foul limit would stop players from flopping around trying to get fouls called against the other team. Heron writes specifically about this foul called against Elvin Hayes in Game 7 of the 1978 NBA Finals. The replay shows that it was a questionable call at best, though Hayes had gotten on the wrong side of the referee beforehand. So in a very real sense, the NBA Finals might have turned on a bad foul call, and because of that rule against picking up too many fouls. Now, in truth, some fouls come because the defender simply has no other choice. But then you've got guys being forced to leave the ballgame after extremely questionable calls like this one. I mean, you tell me, is this charging or blocking? How are these defenders stationary? And so, Michael Jordan fouled out in the fourth quarter after picking up his triple-double. The problem, of course, is that he was targeted and that the 6 foul limit literally changed that game. So then the next question is, what would happen if we had no limit on fouls at all? Well, I'll tell you what would happen. It would be a bloodbath. We've already got enough no calls as it is. Imagine a game with nothing but hard fouls like this over and over again. Honestly, it would be unwatchable. Anyway, all in all, I still think that the 6 foul limit is probably a good thing. Sure, it came about in an arbitrary way, and there's not a lot of evidence that it really works that well, but getting rid of it would promote a style of basketball that's totally unwatchable. But anyway, what do you think?